My husband Marcus introduced me as just the museum assistant to his family lawyer the day he filed for divorce. 2 hours later, his family needed the anonymous appraiser they'd been paying $800 an hour to authenticate their priceless painting before the mistress could inherit it. They just didn't know that appraiser was me. 3 years. Nobody in that conference room had any idea it had been 3 years. Let me back up. I married into the Whitfield family the summer I turned 26, in a tent on a lawn in front of a house older than the state of Massachusetts. My side of the aisle held 11 people. Marcus's side needed a seating chart with a legend. For the first year I believed every bit of it was going to work. Marcus proposed with his grandmother's ring and a line I still remember exactly. "I don't care where you're from, Nora. I care where you're going." I wrote that down in a notebook I kept, like a promise I could hold him to later. I didn't understand yet that some promises are made to a version of you that isn't allowed to stay. The Whitfields ran Whitfield and Locke, an auction house on Newbury Street that had been selling other people's inheritances since 1911. Marcus's mother, Eleanor Whitfield, had a way of saying how lovely that meant the opposite. His father, Griffin, mostly said nothing at all, which I would later understand very differently than I did at 26. At every single Whitfield gathering, there was a check-in table by the door with a box of embossed name tags. Thick cardstock, gold script, one per family member, printed in advance. Mine was never in the box. Some assistant, every single time, would handwrite a blank sticker and press it to my collarbone, "Guest" in blue ballpoint. 6 years. Nobody ever fixed the list, and after the 3rd year, I stopped believing it was really a mistake. I told myself it didn't matter. I had bigger things to be grateful for. That's the thing they count on, that you'll do the math on gratitude yourself, so they never have to. I came from Fall River, 40 minutes and a whole different planet south of Beacon Hill. My father, Patrick Doyle, ran a one-man frame and furniture restoration shop out of a converted garage. Doyle Restoration, hand-painted sign, same one since 1979. He taught me to find a replaced dowel by feel before I could find Massachusetts on a map. He taught me that every honest repair leaves a mark somewhere, on purpose, where only the next restorer will ever look for it. His mark was a shamrock, smaller than a fingernail, cut into the inside edge of the stretcher bar on every piece that passed through his hands, a signature nobody but him was ever supposed to find. I have never had an art history degree, I have calluses. My father died the March after our 2nd anniversary. Heart standing up mid-sentence in the middle of re-gluing a chair rail. I found out from my cousin, not from Marcus, because Marcus was at a preview night for a Whitfield and Locke sale, and didn't check his phone until 11 that night. The Whitfields sent a fruit basket to the wrong address. It sat on a stranger's porch in Somerset for 4 days before anyone thought to mention it. Nobody came to the funeral. Eleanor's card arrived a week later, "Thinking of you both," typed, signed in a hand I recognized as her assistant's. At the wake, an old customer of my father's, a woman whose grandmother's rocking chair he'd rebuilt from a box of splinters 20 years earlier, held both my hands and said, "He was the only honest man I ever paid." I have never once heard anyone in the Whitfield family that way by someone who wasn't being paid to say it. I did not cry in front of any of them, ever. Some people mistake that for strength. It's actually just arithmetic. You learn exactly how much grief a room is willing to hold, and you stop bringing more than that. 4 months after the funeral, I was still working as an assistant conservator at the Harrow Museum of Fine Art, cataloging loans nobody important cared about. A regional collector had sent in a coastal landscape for a group show, minor unsigned, insured for a modest sum. I was logging its condition when I noticed the canvas weave along one edge was slightly too even, too regular, machine consistent in a way hand-woven period canvas never quite is. The kind of thing you only notice if you grew up watching a man run his thumb across 100 canvases a year. I mentioned it quietly to a man doing an unannounced insurance walkthrough of the collection that week. Gray suit, no name tag of his own, the kind of person who asks 2 questions and actually listens to the answer instead of waiting to talk. He crouched down next to the frame without being asked and looked at the exact spot I pointed to for a long time. "You're right," he said, "nobody else on this floor caught that." Then he asked for my number and left before I could ask for his name back. His messages, when they started, came signed with 2 initials and nothing else. BC, that's how every message from the ledger group arrived, then and for 3 years after, case files, questions, wire confirmations. I assumed it was policy. Some firms keep their case managers anonymous the same way they keep their authenticators anonymous. Nobody's identity is a liability if nobody has one. The offer, when it came, was simple and strange. Blind authentication work contracted through the Ledger Group, a firm with a quiet, guarded reputation for rulings that held up in probate court and federal fraud cases both. Total anonymity in both directions. I would never meet a client. Half the time, I wouldn't even meet my own case manager. $800 an hour, more than my entire museum salary in a single long weekend. My first message back to BC was 3 words, "I'm in." 3 seconds later, like he'd been waiting with his thumb over the screen, "Good. Don't disappear on me." I told Marcus I'd picked up freelance cataloging work for extra money. He nodded, already back on his phone, already halfway to some other room in his head. He never once asked what cataloging paid. I stood in our kitchen that night thinking, so this is what invisible feels like from the inside, and being almost grateful for it, because invisible, it turned out, was where all the real work got done. For 3 years I lived 2 lives on the same driver's license. Days, I was the museum assistant everyone at Whitfield family dinners talked over, refilled water glasses for, forgot was fluent in French because nobody had ever asked. Nights and weekends, under a case number instead of a name, I was flown out to look at things worth more than the house I lived in. There was a forged Winslow School landscape in Newport that a hedge fund manager's widow had already agreed to sell for $11 million, until I found a synthetic pigment under the frame that hadn't existed until 1936, 40 years after the artist was dead. There was a disputed estate collection in Charleston where 3 cousins were suing each other over a set of miniatures, and the answer, once I got the loop on them, was that none of the 3 cousins were going to like it equally. BC's messages got shorter and warmer at almost exactly the rate my confidence did. "Careful with this one," he wrote once. "I trust your eye more than the provenance file, and the provenance file is thick." Once, after I'd caught a fourgueur's mistake nobody in 3 states had caught, on a Sunday on my own time he wrote, "Most people rest on weekends." I wrote back, "Most people didn't grow up in a shop where Sunday was just Saturday with better light." He sent back a single line. "I like how your mind works." I read that one more times than I'd like to admit, alone, in hotel rooms paid for by a firm that had never once seen my face. Every dollar I earned that the Whitfields never knew about, I put toward one thing. I bought my father's workshop out of the foreclosure notice that came 4 months after he died, and I kept Doyle Restoration open under a manager's name, sign and all, same hand-painted letters. Nobody in Beacon Hill knew that either. Some inheritances you don't wait for a will to claim. You go get them yourself quietly on a Tuesday, with a cashier's check and a made-up excuse about a business trip. Meanwhile, quietly, unpaid, unthanked, I kept fixing the Whitfield family's own paperwork. Every year Whitfield and Locke's insurance renewal for the private collection crossed the kitchen counter in a manila envelope, and every year I found something, a lapsed rider. A valuation nobody had updated in a decade, a signature missing on page 4 that would have voided the whole policy in a real claim. I always just fixed it, called the broker myself, using Marcus's name, sitting in Marcus's study while he was at the club. Never told anyone. I told myself it was for my marriage. I know now it was mostly habit, the same habit that makes you keep sweeping a floor that was never really yours to sweep, because stopping feels like admitting something out loud you're not ready to say yet. Marcus had a pet project by then, a contemporary gallery space near the harbor called Whitfield Modern, his answer to the family business, his proof he could build something that wasn't just his father's name repainted. It lost money every single year it was open. At a dinner the winter before Griffin got sick, Marcus was complaining about a line of credit renewal, some covenant the bank wanted tightened, and I asked gently whether the gallery's collateral valuation had been reassessed since the original loan, because numbers that old made banks nervous. He looked at me like I'd started speaking a language he didn't know I owned. "It's handled," he said, flat, final, already turning back to his mother. "You don't need to worry about the business side of things, Nora. That's not really your world." Eleanor smiled into her wineglass. I remember thinking, with a kind of cold clarity that should have scared me more than it did, that I had personally caught more fraud since that first afternoon at the museum than everyone at that table combined, and not one of them would ever believe it if I told them. I met Camille Ashworth properly at the museum's spring gala, the one the Whitfields underwrote every year with their name on the program in 18-point type. She had the kind of beauty that photographs like money. She'd known Marcus since prep school, drifted in and out of the family's orbit for a decade under the label old friend, and had recently resurfaced as a gallery consultant specializing, conveniently, in exactly the kind of American landscape painting the Whitfield collection was built on. Some people are born knowing how to look at a painting, she told me that night, glancing at the Guest sticker on my collarbone before I'd even reached for one myself. Someone had already prepared it for me, like they knew I'd be there before I did. Others just dust the frames. Marcus laughed, one short breath through his nose, and didn't correct her. That was the part that stayed with me longer than her line did, not the insult. The silence after it from the one person in the room who actually knew what I did living, or thought he did. I smiled and said nothing. I had learned by then that the coldest thing you can do to someone trying to provoke you is let them think it worked. I went home that night and finished a report on a 19th century seascape more than Camille's entire consulting portfolio, and I signed it with a case number instead of my name, the way I always did. For the first time, it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like keeping score. Griffin Whitfield was the one Whitfield who ever really looked at me. Near the end, throat cancer, 18 brutal months of it, he'd have me sit with him some Sunday afternoons while Eleanor was at the club and Marcus found reasons to be elsewhere. He didn't talk about the business. He asked about Fall River. He asked once whether my father had ever worked on anything important, and I told him no, mostly chairs, mostly frames, mostly other people's grandmother's china. Important is a word rich people use to mean expensive, he said. It's not the same thing. Then he went back to his crossword like he hadn't just handed me something I'd turn over in my head for years. Another Sunday, watching me absent-mindedly turn a chipped teacup over in my hands to check the glaze, the way I'd done 10,000 times without thinking about it, he said out of nowhere, "You've got Doyle hands." I laughed it off as a compliment about being careful. I wouldn't understand until much later that he hadn't meant it as a figure of speech at all. He died in October, 4 days after his 71st birthday, in a hospital bed that had been moved into the front parlor so he could see the street. At the funeral, for the first time in 6 years, someone handed me a real name tag from the embossed box, my full married name in the same gold script as everyone else's. I don't know if it was an accident. I've decided it doesn't matter, because by then I already understood that the only Whitfield who ever really saw me was the one who just stopped being able to say so. The will reading was in Harlan Voss's office on State Street 3 weeks later, all dark wood and a window that didn't quite close all the way, so the traffic noise came up through the floor the whole time like the city itself was impatient. Most of it was ordinary. The house, the cars, a foundation for arts education Eleanor would chair and never fund. Then Voss got to the clause about the painting and cleared his throat in a way that told me, before he even started reading, that this part hadn't been ordinary to write. Windward Light, oil on canvas, painted in 1887 by a minor New England landscapist named Josiah Rourke, had hung above the Whitfield mantel since before Marcus was born. Insured, appraised, whispered about at every family gathering as the crown of the collection, conservatively valued north of $42 million. Griffin's will stipulated that the painting could not transfer to any heir, could not be sold, insured, or loaned, until it had been independently authenticated, by name in writing, by the Ledger Group specifically, no substitutions, within 60 days of the reading. And Voss read on in language dense enough that Marcus's eyes glazed halfway through it. The painting and any proceeds from it would pass to whichever party held legal title as Marcus's spouse at the exact moment such certified transfer was executed. Marcus asked why the Ledger Group, specifically by name. Voss said Griffin had insisted on it personally, months before he died, and hadn't explained why. Eleanor said it was a strange thing for a dying man to fixate on, and reached for Marcus's hand like she already knew what spouse was going to mean to him soon and wanted to get ahead of it. I sat very still in a folding chair with no name tag on it at all and said nothing, because I already knew exactly who signed every message from that firm, and I was starting to understand that Griffin might have known something the rest of us didn't. 60 days, the clock, once it started, never stopped again. Marcus filed for divorce 11 days later, in Voss's same office, the same window still not quite closing, with a family attorney named Priya Nair sitting across from us and a folder already 3 inches thick, tabs color-coded like he'd been building it for longer than 11 days. He hadn't discussed it with me first. He'd apparently discussed it with Camille though. I found that out from the way she was already listed as a future point of contact on his intake paperwork, in his own handwriting, under a line labeled Anticipated Changes to Household. "This is Nora," Marcus said to his lawyer, not looking at me, gesturing in my direction the way you gesture at a chair someone might want to sit in. "She's the museum assistant I mentioned. Not my wife of 6 years. Not Nora Whitfield. Just the museum assistant," present tense, like a job title could retroactively explain 6 years down to something you could staple a settlement number to. His lawyer didn't blink. She'd clearly heard museum assistant before, maybe from Marcus's mouth at a dozen other meetings, while they built a case for a settlement that assumed I brought nothing to that marriage worth accounting for. Alimony came up 11 minutes later like a formality nobody expected me to contest. Priya Nair actually said the words, given the disparity in earning potential, out loud, kindly, like she was doing me a favor by saying it gently. I signed what put in front of me that day. I asked for nothing they didn't already offer. I have never in my life been colder than I was in that room, and none of them noticed, because none of them had ever once looked at my face closely enough to know what my face usually did when something actually hurt. That night I opened the folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk, the one with every Whitfield and Locke insurance renewal I'd quietly corrected for 6 years, brokers' numbers, lapsed riders, all of it in my own handwriting on Marcus's stationery. I closed it again without touching a single page. For 6 years I had fixed what wasn't mine to fix because some small, stupid, hopeful part of me still wanted to belong to people who had decided, a long time ago, that I didn't. That part of me died in a folding chair on State Street, under fluorescent light, next to a window that never fully closed. I didn't cry, I just stopped. It took 11 weeks for anyone to notice. The private collections umbrella policy came up for renewal, and for the first time in 6 years, nobody caught that the underlying valuation on Windward Light hadn't been updated since an appraisal Camille herself had produced years earlier, an appraisal the insurer's own underwriters were no longer willing to accept without independent verification, not with a 9-figure policy and an estate in probate both riding on the same signature. Combined with Griffin's 60-day clock, the family suddenly needed an authentication that was fast, ironclad, and beyond challenge. Whitfield and Locke's reputation, Marcus's remarriage timeline, and $42 million all needed the exact same name at the bottom of the exact same page. My phone rang on a Tuesday, BC, naturally, 3 years, and I had never once heard that voice out loud before that call. "New case," he said. "High-profile estate, Boston, tight deadline." A pause longer than his messages usually left, long enough that I almost said his initials out loud just to fill it. Whitfield. I sat down hard on the edge of my own kitchen counter, in the apartment I'd moved into 11 weeks earlier with 3 boxes and my father's toolbox, and didn't say anything for a full 5 seconds. "If it's too close," he said, quieter than I'd ever heard him, "say so. I'll pull you off it right now. Nobody will ever ask why. That's the whole point of how this firm works, Nora. Nobody has to know anything about you that you don't choose to hand them." I thought about the Guest sticker. I thought about the fruit basket sent to the wrong address. I thought about Doyle hands. "I'll take it." "I thought you might," he said, and there was something in it I couldn't name yet, not surprise. Relief, maybe. I didn't have enough information yet to read it correctly. Not yet. I spent the 4 days before that first site visit rehearsing my own face in the bathroom mirror, the way you'd rehearse a language you used to be fluent in and were afraid you'd lost, composed, unbothered. Exactly the face I'd worn through 6 years of Guest stickers, except this time I'd be wearing it on purpose, as a tool, instead of wearing it because I didn't know how to take it off. I came to the Whitfield townhouse on a Thursday morning in a black blazer, cotton gloves, and a respirator mask I didn't strictly need but always wore anyway, because a mask does something wonderful to a room full of people who've spent years not looking at you. It makes you invisible on purpose instead of by accident. Eleanor let the Ledger Group's technician into the parlor without a single glance above my collarbone, already halfway through a phone call about seating for some fall benefit. Marcus passed through once, on his own call, said "excuse me" to the air somewhere near my shoulder without breaking stride, and never once looked down. 6 years of marriage, and I was less visible to him in a mask than I had been at our own wedding. Camille was already there, curled into the corner of a wingback chair like she owned the room, which in every way that mattered to that family, she basically did now. "It's never once been restored," she told me, watching me set up my lamp and loop with the mild, bored interest of someone supervising a caterer. "That's part of what makes it exceptional. completely untouched since Rark's own hand left it. You'll want to note that clearly in your report." I said nothing. I had already turned the frame 2 inches off the wall and found on the inside edge of the stretcher bar, cut smaller than a fingernail, exactly where only the next restorer would ever think to look, a shamrock. My hands did not shake. I want that on the record, even though nobody in that room would have known to look closely enough to see if they had. My father was 29 years old when he cut that mark, I would learn later, working nights on a piece some collector's estate had sent him for minor conservation, years before I was even born, decades before Josiah Rourke's name meant $42 million to anyone alive. He had held this exact canvas in his hands in a garage in Fall River, 40 minutes and a whole planet from where I was kneeling now. He never once mentioned it to me. He couldn't have known who I'd marry 30 years before I ever met Marcus at a museum fundraiser. He'd just done the work, quietly, correctly, and left his mark where only the next restorer would find it, the way he taught me to. Windward Light had been restored, extensively, skillfully, and according to every piece of paper in the Whitfield file, never at all. One question answered. A dozen new ones opened in the same breath. If the provenance file was wrong about that, on purpose or not, what else in it had been arranged to look cleaner than it actually was? That single fact unraveled the rest in about 6 days of records requests, subpoenaed shipping logs, and very unhelpful gallery archivist who kept needing to check with counsel. The provenance dossier underpinning the painting's $42 million valuation, the one that claimed unbroken family ownership and pristine, untouched condition since 1887, had been assembled 9 years earlier by a gallery consultant hired on Marcus's own recommendation, Camille Ashworth. Here is what the fraud referral eventually reconstructed, from her own handwritten notes and a shipping manifest nobody had thought to shred. 9 years earlier, in a cramped gallery office 2 floors above a frame shop in the South End, Camille sat with a stack of condition reports and a bottle of correction fluid she shouldn't have needed for a document that was already typed. She crossed out one line, minor restoration noted along stretcher bar, 1958, and retyped the page clean. Griffin had asked her for a valuation strong enough to secure a loan for his son's new gallery. A pristine, never-touched masterwork insured for triple what an honestly repaired one would. She made one call before she sent it over, to Marcus, not to Griffin. "Tell your father it's done," she said. "Tell him not to ask me how." She never once wrote my father's name down anywhere Griffin would see it. She simply made him disappear from a piece of paper, the same way 9 years later, Marcus would try to make me disappear from a room. I didn't know any of this yet, not that Thursday morning on my knees by the fireplace. I only knew the mark was real, and the file said it wasn't, and one of those 2 things was going to have to lose. The dossier, it turned out, had been the collateral document behind every credit renewal Whitfield Modern had leaned on since it opened, the same line of credit Marcus had waved off at that dinner table as handled. Nobody had ever ordered a fresh valuation. Camille's paperwork had simply looked airtight enough for 9 straight years that no one felt the need to check. She hadn't just overstated a provenance once. She had fabricated a restoration history to erase my father's honest work entirely, because an untouched masterwork insures for triple what an honestly repaired one does, and Marcus's gallery needed triple just to survive another renewal. Every wrongful act needs a consequence eventually. I was starting to understand I might be the one required to hand it to them. Word travels strangely in small industries. 5 days before my final report was due, Harlan Voss's office sent the Ledger Group a letter, polite, procedural, entirely reasonable sounding on its face, requesting a substitution of authenticators, citing timeline concerns and recommending a firm Camille herself had used twice before, one with a much thinner reputation for asking hard questions. For the better part of a day, it looked like it might actually work. It looked like $42 million and a fraud 9 years deep might slide through on a technicality of scheduling, the same way everything else in that family had always slid through, because nobody with the power to stop it had ever cared enough to read the fine print. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the shamrock, small enough to miss if you weren't looking, and how easy it would be for the whole truth to end up exactly that small too, if the wrong committee got to decide who was allowed to look for it. BC called near midnight, and for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't calm. "They can't touch this," he said before I'd even said hello. Griffin named this firm in the will by name, no substitutions, and he made me put that in writing 3 months before he died. I have the letter, Nora. I don't think he ever told his own family why he wanted it that specific. I think he already suspected something and wanted to make sure whoever ended up looking wouldn't be someone he could talk out of it later. I asked him, quietly, how he'd come to know Griffin Whitfield well enough for any of that. There was a pause I would remember later, once I had all the pieces to understand it correctly. I didn't, really, he said. Not personally. But I read every filing on this family the week the divorce was announced, the probate docket, the will, all of it. I made sure this case came to you specifically. I should have told you that from the start instead of letting you think it was a coincidence. The switch attempt died the next morning, buried under Griffin's own signature on a letter dated 3 months before his death. I didn't have time yet to sit with what BC had just admitted to me at midnight. The clock hadn't stopped for that. It never once stopped for anything. I drove down to Fall River that Sunday before I finished the report, alone, and let myself into my father's shop with a key I still carried on the same ring as my apartment. The sign was exactly the way he'd left it. Marisol Reyes, the sharp 23-year-old I'd hired to run the place, had left the lights off and the bench swept, the way he always used to. She'd left a note on the bench too, in the same small, steady hand she used for condition reports. Whatever you're dealing with, the wood will still be here when you're done. I didn't know yet how much I needed to hear that from someone who'd learned it, the same way I had, by watching somebody else's hands. I sat in his chair for a while. I didn't cry either. I just let my hands rest on the same worn wood his hands had rested on, and thought about how a man who never once got his name on anything had still managed to leave a mark that a $42 million fraud couldn't survive contact with. I finished the report that night at my own kitchen table, my father's toolbox still sitting in the coat closet because I hadn't found the right place for it yet. I didn't write it angry. I wrote it the way he taught me to leave a mark, precise, factual, exactly where the next person looking would need it to be. Undisclosed restoration 1958, attributable by workshop mark. Provenance dossier materially inconsistent with physical evidence. Insurable value requires full revaluation pending fraud referral. I did not write one single word about a marriage. I let the facts be the whole of it. That's the part of this business that took me 3 years to learn. You don't have to raise your voice when the paperwork is already screaming. The certification meeting was set for a Thursday. Back in Harlan Voss's office, the same window still not quite closing all the way, like it had been waiting for this specific morning too. Marcus was there, in the good suit he wore for closings. Eleanor was there in a suit the color of money, already composing, I'm sure, whatever version of this story she planned to tell at the club by Friday. Camille was there, in the front row, like she still had a stake in the outcome, which, legally, in about 9 minutes, she was about to lose entirely. Whitfield and Locke's insurance underwriter sent a representative with a legal pad and no small talk. A reporter from a trade publication that covers major authentications had somehow gotten wind of it and sat quietly in the back row with a notebook, which told me the art world's rumor mill had already started turning before the facts had. Beckett Cole walked in 8 minutes before I did. I knew him instantly and not at all. The voice matched a face for the first time in 3 years, right there in a marble hallway, and something in my chest did something I hadn't planned for or budgeted time to feel. He looked at me the way nobody in that building ever had, not once, in 6 years. Not through me. At me like I was the only fixed point in a room that hadn't stopped moving. Ready? He said, quiet just for me. I've been ready for 3 years, I said, and walked in ahead of him. Voss introduced me formally, reading straight off the certification cover page in the flat, careful voice of a man who has learned exactly how much weight a sentence can carry. The Ledger Group's authenticator of record on this matter, he read. Nora Whitfield. Nobody said anything for 4 full seconds. I counted them. Eleanor's mouth actually opened, no sound behind it. Marcus went the color of the wall behind him. Camille's hand found the arm of her chair like she needed it to confirm it was still there. You're the museum assistant, Marcus finally said, like he was accusing me of something, like I was the one who'd been dishonest in that room. I was never just anything, I said. You just never asked. I laid it out plainly, the way I'd written it. The shamrock mark, and my father's original restoration ledger, still legible, still sitting in a box in a workshop 40 minutes south of that room, in his own handwriting. Camille's 9-year-old dossier, and the line of credit it had propped up under Whitfield Modern for nearly a decade. The insurer's own written confirmation that they would not renew coverage on the prior valuation under any circumstance. I did not raise my voice once. I did not need to. The room did enough of that on its own. Eleanor tried, at the very end, one last time, the way people like her always try one last time. I think, she said, voice pitched for an audience that had already stopped being on her side. We should all remember that some people confuse being useful with being owed something. I let that sit in the room for exactly as long as it deserved, which was no time at all, and then I simply kept talking, the way you keep walking past a dog that's barking at a car it can't actually catch. Camille found her voice before anyone else did. I worked from the documentation the family provided me, she said, too quickly, already reaching for the version of this where she was just another victim of somebody else's bad paperwork. I'm a consultant, not a forensic examiner. You wrote the report, I said. You crossed out the one line that would have told the truth and you retyped the page clean. I've seen the original before your correction fluid. I hadn't planned on saying that part yet. I said it anyway because for the first time in 6 years I didn't have to plan anything. I could just tell the truth, in order, and let it land wherever it landed. Voss cleared his throat and found the clause again, the one about the spouse, and read it out loud a second time. For the official record, the way he'd read it once already at the will reading without anyone in that family understanding what they were hearing. Transfer of the painting and any proceeds from it, to whichever party held legal title as Marcus's spouse at the exact moment of certified authentication. My divorce would not be final for another 11 days. At 9:42 that Thursday morning, in the eyes of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that was still, on paper, me. The room went very quiet in a different way than before. I didn't ask for the painting. I watched Marcus's face do a complicated, ugly thing while he waited to hear what I would ask for instead, and I let him wait exactly as long as I needed to. Then I said it plainly enough that Voss wrote all 3 down without needing me to repeat a word. Full documented back payment for 6 years of insurance corrections I had personally performed for the estate, unpaid, itemized with dates. Formal, permanent attribution on Windward Lights provenance record crediting Patrick Doyle's original restoration by name, in writing, forever attached to the piece. And the painting's donation, once cleared, to the Harrow Museum of Fine Art, where I still technically, on paper, worked as an assistant, at least for another few weeks. That's it? Marcus said, and I understood, from the way he said it, that he still thought this was about money, even now, even after everything I'd just laid on the table in front of a reporter. That's everything, I said. You just never learn to tell the difference. The rest moved the way these things move once the paper starts talking instead of the people. The insurer opened a formal fraud referral naming Camille Ashworth within the week, her consulting license suspended pending review before the month was out. Whitfield and Locke's board voted Marcus off day-to-day operations before the same month ended. Once it became clear Whitfield Modern's line of credit had been secured on documents that would not survive an audit anyone actually ran, the engagement, such as it had been, quietly dissolved. I heard, secondhand, through Marisol, who heard it from someone at a gallery opening, that Camille left before the ink on the referral letter was even dry, the same way she'd have left the first time, if there had ever really been anything under the provenance she sold him besides a well-dressed lie. Eleanor sent no card this time. I didn't expect one, and for the first time in 6 years that didn't cost me anything to admit. Windward Light hangs at the Harrow Museum now, in a gallery I used to dust as an assistant nobody looked at twice. The placard credits Josiah Rourke, 1887, and beneath the restoration history, in the same small, respectful type as everything else, it credits Patrick Doyle, 1958. My father never to see his name under glass. I go stand in front of it some Sunday mornings anyway, the way he used to have me sit with him on his. I still don't know exactly how much Griffin Whitfield knew, or when, or what made a dying man write one specific firm's name into a legal document instead of just letting the lie he'd funded stand quietly, the way his wife would have. I know he never fixed it while he was alive. I know he made sure someone else finally could, and that whoever that someone turned out to be, he'd trusted them with it on purpose. I've decided that's the closest thing to an apology that family ever managed to give me, and I've decided it's enough. Doyle Restoration is still open, sign and all, run now by Marisol, who I found the exact same way Beckett once found me, by watching what she noticed that nobody else in the room did. Beckett kept my coffee order memorized for 3 years off one offhand line in a 2 a.m. email about a case in Charleston. He handed it to me, exactly right, oat milk, no sugar, the first time we ever stood in the same room outside of Harlan Voss's office. No card, no note, like it wasn't a big thing at all. It was the biggest thing anyone had done for me in longer than I want to admit out loud. He asked, that same afternoon, if he could finally take me to dinner somewhere that wasn't a courthouse hallway or a hotel lobby between flights. I said yes before he finished the sentence. 3 years of careful, warm, 2 a.m. messages, and it turned out the easiest decision in the whole story was the last one. Nobody has handed me a sticker that says Guest in over a year now. I don't think I'd take one if they tried. I wasn't the museum assistant, I never really had been, I just hadn't needed anyone in that family to agree with me anymore. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.